thank you both for an excellent presentation and for covering what happens in the lab and then what happens at the clinic or bedside. So, Dr. Peyton, you mentioned the timeline from bench to bedside is around 10 years at least. And you also went through the different phases, phase 1, phase 2, phase 3, phase 4. I'm curious to know how many of the trials or actually make it, what percentage make it to that phase 3, phase 4? There's a lot of investment in these trials. Do all of them make it to the end?
Good question. I don't know the exact answer to that question, but it's very limited. Most, and Jade, you can comment on this more than I can. Most investigational drugs in the labs don't even make it to the phase 1 trial. And then it's attrition thereafter. So I don't have an absolute number for you, but there's a lot of great ideas in the lab that don't pan out in humans. And that's
I think we
repeatedly.
should be a little bit specific about that timeline. I mean, that's I think what you're talking about is, discovery of a drug, testing the drug in vitro in the cells and in animals, moving to clinical trials, and then de novo, a brand new drug. That takes a long time.
Right.
But, for example, the study where I was talking about EZH2 inhibitors and PI3 kinase inhibitors, those are medications that are already being used for different indications. And so that's a little bit different. They're already FDA approved and being used in humans. And so if you find a new indication for them in bladder cancer, the timeline's a lot quicker. So it's I don't want to paint a bleak picture like, everything's going to take decades. In some cases, it's a little bit quicker than that.
Great. Thank you for explaining. I think that speaks about the complexity and that it's not a linear process necessarily, and just so much that there is to learn about this. So you talked about different clinical trials at UAB, and there's a question from one of our participants who's interested in knowing how the clinical trial findings at UAB are shared with other bladder cancer researchers.
So that's a good question. So the 3 bladder cancer trials that I mentioned are national trials. They are not my trials. I'm just the leader at UAB, right? There's a national PI as well. Like the bridge one where I was talking about the upfront BCG versus is a phase 3 randomizing. The lead PI on that is Max Cates. He's at Hopkins. I know him, and he asked me to open the trial, so I opened them. So bladder, urology is not that big of a group. Urologic oncology is not that big of a group. And then the people that really like bladder cancer in the country, we all know each other. So, we go to meetings annually, and then we get updates on these big trials on how they're doing, how they're accruing. And I get periodic emails from the leads on these nationally as far as how well they're enrolling and whatnot. So it's constant communication. And when you're talking about big clinical trials that have a lot of money invested in them, a lot of dollars, the sponsors who are paying for it are monitoring that data very closely. So it's not just there's constant communication on what the results are. Now, if you have a local trial, which can be done, an investigator-initiated trial, which is a local trial in your own institution, that's something that we always want to do and strive to do with something like what Jed is talking about. That data would be kept we would not necessarily make it public until we understand more of what our data means, because no one else is looking at it. That's a very different scenario than what I described.
Yeah, and then ultimately you share your findings at conferences, national conferences, and BCAN think tanks, and publications, and get the word out there to get on the stump and share to the world what you've learned.
Excellent. Thanks for answering that.
More questions?
There was a question that you mentioned the cost on the researchers side. Are there any costs for that for the clinical trials for participating for patients? Do insurance cover them? What is the patient financial responsibility, if any, if participating in the clinical trial?
Usually, they're completely covered. So within each clinical trial, there's standard of care, and your insurance in and of itself will cover standard of care. They will cover that, but drug expenses and all that stuff that insurance companies are never going to pay for are not paid for by the patient in general. For instance, that trial I discussed with the company that was sponsoring is Janssen. I mean, Janssen has invested millions and millions of dollars in this, and it's paid for. So the cost to the patient shouldn't be any more than standard of care. In fact, it's less in a lot of times because for people that are traveling on ways, there's ways to petition the company to give you stipends for travel and various other ways to get reimbursed for some expenses that may not be maybe out of the ordinary for some folks. If you're coming the long way, for instance.
Thank you for answering that.
A couple other questions we can address if you want us to. So Rose O'Rourke was asking about radiation before surgery. That's a not usually would be the answer there. And then they asked about EV, which is a new Nectin-4 inhibitor that is a new type of chemotherapy, and it is been doing very well. Results have been good with a lot of that. Neither Jed and I are medical oncologists, so our colleagues in medical oncology are the ones who give those medicines. We get to see the results of them a lot of the times, and the results for the EV medicine when it's combined with immunotherapy has been very robust so far in my experience. It's not there's a big trial ongoing right now that will be that the updated results from a GU ASCO, which was done several months ago, was very encouraging, but not conclusive. Oh, good. So your husband was on trial at Penn, so he probably gets treated by Phil Pizzario, and we all know each other there.
One of the questions that we got during the registration process was around bladder transplant research. Is there anything around that you can share with us today?
I don't know that work very well, but I could tell you that just off the bat, the challenge with bladder transplant is going to be every transplant needs vascular supply. And in order to make vascular anastomoses with the small and multiple blood vessels that go to the bladder is going to be the major barrier there, or one of the major barriers. So I think that's something that people are trying to get around and address.
There's work in the mid early 2000s on not necessarily bladder transplant, but scaffold matrix bladders that have been seeded with people's own stem cells to grow urothelium, and that was done in the early 2000s, and it was well investigated and not particularly robustly successful. But
again, because of blood supply.
Yeah, that's the main reason.
Good to understand that. And then there was also a question about tumor genomics profiling. At what point should that be done for a patient, or should a patient request that?
Yeah, so that's a great question. And I love doing these because the patients on here are so smart and so well informed. It's great. But it's a moving target. It's not always covered by insurance currently. I don't think we have enough data to in each kind of decision point to support it for the payers. So that's fairly variable. You can pay for it out of pocket. Now, let's just assume that money grows on trees and we could get it done for everybody. We don't always understand how to interpret the data and act on the data. So that's the next big thing is trying to make sure that we understand how we can act on the data. I think we're a little bit further along in that process in the stage 4 setting. And as we get more knowledge from stage 4, we'll be able to hopefully trickle that down to earlier stages as well.
It's Jed's right on the money. I mean, oncology is just in general is, grown tremendously, and then this is what precision oncology will be. We're not there in every cancer, but that's the idea, is to tailor the treatment to the patient's genomic profiling of those tumors. Because a lot of times we overtreat patients, a lot of times we undertreat patients, and understanding that is what he's commenting on. And it's not there yet, but within our lifetime, it will be hopefully commonplace. But again, like anything else, getting it paid for is hard.
So short answer to your question, I think if you have the means to get it done and can afford it, I think you're not going to lose much by it. But I think at some point in the near future, we'll have a better idea how to use that data.
Related to clinical trials, do they often cover the costs for profiling?
It's often incorporated in many clinical trials, yes, because that data is really important to see how medicines or therapies will react with some genetic mutations and not others. So it's very common to have that.
And it's getting cheaper and cheaper. Now it, and quicker and quicker. So it used to be when they sequenced the human genome initially, it took years and years and years and years and billions of dollars. And now it costs about $1,000 and takes a couple of weeks. So it's just amazing the technological advances with next generation sequencing.
That is very true. I think about, when the Genome Project got started, but it also reminds me of, and I think a conversation we were having before the webinar started about research in bladder cancer and how many advancements there have been in the past 5, 10, even year. And so as we reach the end of the webinar, I wanted to ask if from both of you, what is the single most important message you want our participants today to leave with?
As you want to start, or
sure. I mean, we were talking about clinical trials today, so I guess my most important thing to say is that don't, as a patient, you should be open to those opportunities and talk with your treating provider about them if any are available to you. Sometimes you're not right for the trial, or you won't do, and that's okay too. But the first step is at least asking.
Yeah, and I would just say keep the hope and keep plugging. And there are amazing possibilities in the future and in the near future and in the pipeline. So stay involved with BCAN and ask your providers for information and be an advocate for yourself, and just keep the hope up. I mean, we can all beat this.
Those are great words to bring us to close. I want to thank both of you, Dr. Peyton, Dr. Ferguson. Thank you so much for taking the time to share information about clinical trials and answering questions from our participants. I also want to thank our sponsors, Merck and UroGen, for making this webinar possible. And of course, to our participants, we hope to see you next time. Have a great evening, and thanks again for joining us.